What should we eat for dinner? I don't know about your family, but in mine, this is a question that reverberates around our household every Friday night. And like all Friday nights, my brother and I nearly go to blows over the meal choice.
I, obviously, picked a venue featuring the most superior of foods, sushi, plus the hibachi buffet that served sushi also served rainbow sherbet, which if I recall, you loved.
I was in the mood for a classic, for a greasy soft shell stuffed to the brim with chicken, rice and beans, and lettuce. I bet your mouth is watering right now, isn't it?
And just like all Friday nights, this was bound to end the same way. My sister wearing her 3 extra years on me like a crown while stuffing her face with tacos.
Being siblings, members of the Parkland debate team, and rather opinionated individuals in general, we like to consider ourselves experts in conflict. Disclaimer, however, we are not. But regardless, throughout our contentious years, we have identified 3 main roles that tend to appear when arguing over how to best achieve a common goal. First, we have the overbearing majority. Now, the overbearing majority doesn't actually have to have a majority. They just act like they do. Tending to be the ones that dominate conversation, they often make sure their voice is heard and get their way, regardless or not of whether their passion is circumstantial or merely their personality. If you've ever listened to a group presentation where one voice simply rises over all the rest, chances are you've discovered the overbearing majority. Next, we have the vocal minority. Now, similarly, the vocal minority doesn't actually have to have a minority. They just usually aren't the ones whose idea is implemented at the very end. Regardless, they vehemently disagree and they want you to know it. And they tend to be the main opponents to the overbearing majority. The way that I like to think of it is the Joker to their Batman, minus the clear implications of right and wrong, of course. Now, I could probably leave it at these 2 roles and you would be content. That's because when we tend to think of a conflict, we focus on the 2 main oppositional sides or ideas. In the initial argument between my brother and I, it was sushi versus tacos. In World War II, it was the Axis versus the Allied powers. In Harry Potter, it was the Order versus the Death Eaters. But in most group conflicts, there tends to be another role, a third party that lurks along the sidelines unseen. My brother and I, we like to call them the ghosts. They tend to be comprised of opinions other than that of the overbearing majority and vocal minority. In essence, because they don't align themselves with either of the 2 oppositional sides, they tend to have no real sway in the conclusion. They are the victims of polarization and the voices missing from key conversations.
In our initial scenario, this invisibility of the third party doesn't seem all that relevant. After all, aren't all siblings like that? But if we take this and apply it to something a little bit more substantial, the danger becomes apparent. I'm a bit of a history nerd, so I'm going to use a well-known historical event as an example. In 1789, the people of France overthrew an oppressive monarchy and sought to build a society where liberty and justice prevailed. You guessed it, this is the story of the French Revolution. However, their optimism was quickly quelled when France launched into a 10-year period of pain and oppression known as the Reign of Terror. 2 factions, the Jacobins and the moderates, disagreed on how to best represent the people, leading to the Jacobins taking complete control. They became a cult of personality and a crackdown on civil liberties ensued, hurting the very people they claimed to represent. In essence, the Jacobins were the overbearing majority, the moderates, the vocal minority, and the people of France, the ones focused on their own lives rather than getting caught up in political crossfire? Well, they were the ghosts, the voices that went unheard. All 3 parties were equally dependent on the ideal solution, which would be a government that best represented all the people, but only 2 of them had any real say. Only the Jacobins and the moderates could do anything about it. So, by that metric, the French Revolution failed, as it failed to provide a conclusion that benefited everybody. Now, it is important to remind yourself that this is an oversimplification of historical events. After all, we are assuming that all 3 parties wanted an equally representative government, but we'll get back to that later.
Now let's move away from the French Revolution because, frankly, my head is starting to spin. From a distance, it is easy to pick out the 3 roles in a conflict, their basic characteristics, and what went wrong in the conclusion of said conflict. But when the story becomes a little bit more personal, when you find yourself already immersed within a role, that becomes rather difficult. It is easy to preach recognition and awareness until you're forced to confront your own lack thereof. During my sophomore year, I attended a summer camp in Washington, D.C., centered around international relations and diplomacy. One day, we walked into the classroom to see that the tables had been rearranged like this, with one in the center and the rest forming a circle around it. We took our seats, my friends and I claiming the ones in the center, and began our assignment. We were tasked with coming up with a list of 5 words that best represented a global citizen. Given that this was a class activity and we were seated in the center of the room, the rest of the tables flocked towards us. Looking back on it, the most jarring part is how successful I thought we were. When we presented our list to the teacher, I was confident that it represented not only the views of myself, but my fellow classmates and what best represented a global citizen. That is, until I was instructed to look around the room and I saw the frowns on several of my classmates' faces. I took another look at the list and realized that 3 out of the 5 words came from my friends and I in the center. Without realizing it, I had become a member of the overbearing majority. My teacher set me up. It was quite unfortunate. However, when this was first pointed out to me, I didn't really get what the problem was. There was a little voice in the back of my head saying, well, we were just more vocal than they were. We had opinions and we made sure that they were heard. So it only makes sense that the list be representative of our views. If they wanted their words on the list, they should have just tried harder. Right? Wrong. Because in the chaos of fighting for what I thought was right, I forgot that we were supposed to be working towards a common goal. This list was supposed to be representative of all of our views, but we got so caught up in fighting for our own agenda that we talked over everybody else. Now, let's move on to talk a little bit about how we can resolve these conflicts.
So far, we've learned about the 2 failures, where a conflict failed to result in a resolution that benefited everybody involved. We've also learned about the 3 roles to a typical conflict: the overbearing majority, the vocal minority, and the ghosts, as well as how their role affects the conclusion. But we live in America, in a democracy, where our governmental policies are made up by this very debate and discourse in order to create a scenario where everybody is happy. Well, mostly. But let's discuss how we can adjust the dynamics of our roles in order to generate a successful outcome. First, we must do exactly what we did earlier in this talk: be able to recognize the 3 roles and how we fit into them. Ask yourself these questions. How often are you speaking? Are you listening to others or merely opposing them? And most importantly, who isn't speaking? The only way to avoid us from tripping into the pitfalls of our respective roles is to truly be aware of our portrayal of them. And why waste time getting defensive when we know we've made a mistake when you can just change the behavior and move on? This mindset is key to changing the very nature of a conflict to something centered around growth and a healthy conclusion. Speaking of which, that brings us directly into our next step, keeping the goal in mind. It is very easy to get caught up on the why, on the how, that we forget the why. Or does your contribution to an argument only benefit you? Are you opposing another's idea merely because you see it as a threat to your own? Put your pride and your ego aside and focus on the good of the group, and I promise it'll be more beneficial in the long run.
There's actually a continuation to my summer camp story that ties perfectly into that. At the end of our 2 weeks in DC, we decided to redo the activity where we came up with a list of 5 words. This time, however, we were allowed to choose the format. And so we elected a leader, someone who had expressed discomfort with how the activity was run last time. And she actually accepted nominations for the words and then facilitated voting procedure so that we could narrow them down. Sadly enough, none of my words were chosen, but I was actually pretty okay with that. The words on the board were still accurate, and there was a general sense of agreement and achievement within the classroom. Now, while these 2 steps are absolutely key, neither is nearly as efficient without the implementation of the last one. We must empower the ghosts. Lacking a seat at the table of discourse and discussion, it is the responsibility of the former overbearing majority and vocal minority to make room. In fact, it is this act that allows us to finally shed our roles for good. The overbearing majority is finally letting out someone else speak. The vocal minority is no longer merely in opposition, and the ghosts are finally visible. By adding a third voice to the conversation, we have found the potential for a middle ground and an alternative, mutually beneficial solution. In fact, there's a well-known adage in the business industry that goes something like this. Back when we used horse and carriage to get around, a carriage company decided that they wanted to expand their business. And so they approached their customers and asked what they would like to see in order for them to want to buy more carriages. Their customers responded, "We want faster horses." The carriage company decided they wanted a little bit more input, and so they approached customers of rival carriage companies. These customers responded with, "We want larger carriages." Now, this carriage company was caught in between 2 sides, and so they decided to approach a third party that hadn't even been included in the initial conversation: the people who walked on the streets to get around. When asked the very same question, they responded, "We want there to be less horse poop." And ladies and gentlemen, that is how the car was created. Now, the accuracy of this story remains questionable, but its message rings true. Adding a third party to the conversation allows us to keep our goal in mind and actually reach a solution that is beneficial towards all. So now, I want to direct your attention back to that initial scenario, the argument between my brother and I on whether we should eat sushi versus tacos. Who were the ghosts? Now, I'll give you a few seconds to figure that out because, frankly, it took us weeks. But it was our parents, the people who had to eat exactly what we did, and were actually paying for that matter.
So, Mom and Dad, what do you want to eat?